Well, our final lecture in this conference is perhaps the most personally intriguing of all. Pieter Zonne is a local legend for his role in helping to found Cedar Grove. And if you are so inclined afterwards, you could drive 3 minutes up the road and visit his grave in the Presbyterian cemetery just north of town. This is as local as it gets. Furthermore, this particular congregation, Calvary OPC, descended from the congregation that Pieter Zonne founded, the First Presbyterian Church of Cedar Grove. And in a certain sense, Calvary is something like a daughter church. But there's another aspect which I find intensely interesting, and that is Zonne's pioneering work as a Dutch Presbyterian. I myself am a Dutch Presbyterian. I was raised in the Christian Reformed Church before discovering the PCA during my college years. I was ordained in the PCA, and I sojourned there for a time before eventually finding a very comfortable home in the OPC. Dutch Presbyterians are rare birds. It is true that they are more plentiful in certain ecclesiastical settings, such as the OPC. They are also more common in certain places, like Sheboygan County. But on the whole, Dutch Presbyterians are statistically insignificant. It could be even asked whether we really constitute a legitimate category. That said, I truly love my Dutch heritage, and I am exceedingly fond of Presbyterianism. I'm also aware that I am not the only one who has valued this unique hybrid of the Dutch Reformed and Scottish Presbyterian influences. Dr. J. Gresham Machen sought in the 1930s to create a faculty at Westminster Seminary that had the strong Dutch influences of Ned Stonehouse, R.B. Kuyper, Cornelius Van Til, and others, alongside the Scottish perspective of John Murray. It's also not insignificant that the Reverend John J. de Ward, the founding pastor of Calvary OPC, was a Dutchman who served in the OPC, being the moderator of the Third General Assembly, as well as serving on the board of Westminster Seminary for many years. So it is fitting that we wrap up the age of pioneers with the pioneer of Dutch Presbyterianism in America, the Reverend Pieter Zonne. So let me take you back to the Netherlands. Pieter Zonne was born on August 4, 1807 in Vlaardingen, a suburb of Rotterdam in the southwest corner of the Netherlands. He was the first of 4 children. His father owned a prosperous barrel-making operation, and Peter was baptized in the Reformed State Church. In a brief biographical sketch of the Reverend Pieter Zonne, written by his descendant, Mr. J.G. Zonne of Zuiderland, the Netherlands, Peter was 1.79 meters tall, that's about 5 feet 10 inches, with a round face and an ordinary forehead. His eyes were blue, his nose was small, his mouth broad, his chin round, his hair and eyebrows light brown. He possessed no outstanding physical characteristics. At age 21, he borrowed money from his father in order to purchase a sail-making business in the city of Delft. A gifted businessman, Peter was successful and prosperous. He was a respected member of the community and a member of the Reformed State Church in his city. In 1830, he united in marriage with Adriana Wilhelmina de Waal, and together they would have 8 children. Significant changes came to the church in the Netherlands in 1816. The Dutch Reformed Church had long been in spiritual decline. Not only did the National Synod introduce certain changes, but King William I took a hand in the reorganization of the church. These changes significantly relaxed the standards of that church. At that time, the Dutch Reformed Church became an established church, controlled at least in part by the civil government. In reaction to these developments, a secession movement began in 1834, which had a profound influence on ecclesiastical life in the Netherlands. This became known as the Afscheiding. John Meether describes the situation in his excellent biography of Cornelius van Til. Meether writes, "The Dutch government sought to put a quick end to the secession or Afscheiding. Persecution accompanied the growth of the seceder congregations. Worship was severely restricted, and the military was deployed to disrupt illegal services. Ministers were disciplined, and in some cases even fined and sentenced to jail. Businesses often dismissed secession sympathizers from their secular employment. Mobs damaged seceder homes and barns and assaulted their members. Yet in the midst of this opposition, the movement grew." Pieter Zonne joined the Afscheiding, first as an elder and later as an ordained minister. On March 20, 1836, he was present at a Sunday evening meeting held at a business in Delft. A mob of 40 ruffians had gathered outside and were breaking windows on the building. Inside, a group of 26 people was discussing Romans 6, verse 17, when the police arrived. Since the meeting had not received a permit from the government, the owner of the shop was issued a legal citation. This sort of persecution from both mobs of hooligans and from the police force became a regular feature in the life of these seceders. Zonne continued participating in the secession, and he helped found a secessionist church in Delft, where he then served as an elder. In 1841, Zonne began studying for the ministry under Anthony Brummelkamp, a prominent minister in the Afscheiding. In 1842, Zonne was approved for the ministry and was ordained. During this time, he was also influenced by Hendrik Peter Scholte, and he had dealings with Albertus C. van Raalte. Both Scholte and van Raalte would emigrate to America around the same time as Zonne's relocation. The years 1842 to 1847 contained opportunity for ministry mingled with increasing persecution, both from the general population and from government officials. In addition, relationships within the secession movement were often disagreeable. Some people were hypercritical. Can you imagine that? Dutch people, hypercritical and even disagreeable. Not surprisingly, various factions developed and contended with each other for influence and power within the movement. This led, in part, to a departure for America. The persecution of the seceders took its toll on Zonne and his followers. The harsh government policies became increasingly onerous and disheartening. In his brief biographical sketch, J.G. writes, "As early as July 1, 1846, Peter had come to the conclusion that if the revised Constitution remains the law of the land, we know the way we must go. We must leave this country because of the governmental oppression. He adds, we would rather leave our fatherland, precious though it might be to us, than that we should subject ourselves to the demand of the government. By this action, Peter, seemingly motivated by frustration and longing for universal freedom of religion, joins himself to the group of emigrants desiring to go to the United States of America. Another factor that contributed to his decision to emigrate is what Brian Winter calls Zonne's strong and independent leadership style. It's a nice way of saying he was a hard-headed Dutchman. Zonne's ability to lead and to inspire confidence in his followers was a strength in his labors to establish new secessionist congregations, but it also brought him into conflict with other leaders in the movement and even within local congregations. He sought to promote peace between feuding factions of the secessionist movement, but his peacemaking efforts were not appreciated, nor were they particularly effective. This led to further resistance and conflict, and even to him being suspended from the ministry by the Reverends Meerbrug, Van Raalte, and Brummelkamp. At other times, Scholte and Van Raalte had experienced similar censures. At this time, emigration to the United States was being coordinated in the Netherlands. One organization chose Van Raalte as their leader, and they eventually looked to West Michigan for their new home. There they established Howland, Michigan, and other neighboring towns and cities. And due to the planning done prior to their departure, there was financial backing for the settlement, as well as a pipeline of immigrants traveling to Michigan. A similar effort was designed for Scholte and his supporters. Their destination was Pella, Iowa. There, they put many plans into place even prior to their departure, and they had a similar conduit for immigrants to settle in the rich farmland of southern Iowa. This community, much like the Western Michigan effort, was well-funded, well-organized, and highly successful. They also had controlling interests back in the Netherlands that dictated the types of churches that would be established in the New World. And this funneled into the Reformed Church in America and later to the development of the Christian Reformed Church. I might also mention that there were other factors going on in the Netherlands at this time that further complicated the situation. There were many crop failures, and there was a potato blight very similar to the potato famine in Ireland. And because of agricultural situations in the Netherlands, many people said, we cannot survive here, we need to go to America. Well, Pieter Zonne's situation was far different from what Scholte or Van Raalte faced. The area of the Netherlands that Zonne came from did not send many immigrants to the U.S. The number of followers was considerably smaller than those of either Iowa or Michigan. Furthermore, there was not an established pipeline for future immigration bringing people from the Netherlands to Wisconsin. Brian Winter summarizes this as follows. In contrast with Dutch immigration to Michigan and Iowa, no large immigration societies settled in Wisconsin. Rather, Dutch immigrants who arrived in Wisconsin came in smaller private groups and relied on individual efforts to make the trip. This piecemeal pattern of immigration left unresolved the question of how churches would be organized once settlers arrived at their final destination. It also provided greater latitude to ministers on the issue of church affiliation. So in some senses, Wisconsin is apples, West Michigan and Pella, Iowa are oranges. Very different situation for them. This brings us now to Milwaukee and the Phoenix. With a group of 160 immigrants, Zonne set out for America. J.G. relates the journey. They departed via the North Holland Canal on May 23, 1847. The journey across the ocean was stormy. Only after 49 days were they able to land in New York. From there, they took a steamboat, which required a journey of 16 days via the Hudson River, the Erie Canal, and the Great Lakes. Zonne and his followers landed in Milwaukee in July 1847. In northwest Milwaukee, there was an area known as Holland Hill, or Dutch Hill, where many Dutch immigrants stayed upon their arrival. J.G. relates that a room was rented, and for more than a year, Peter preached there but received no remuneration. A young man who had emigrated earlier and later became a minister himself testified that Peter's sermons indicated that he was, without doubt, a talented preacher whose pulpit style I found very attractive. Now, I think the details of J.G. are a little bit fuzzy here. Peter did not stay in Milwaukee for over a year. It was less than a year. And it seems that he was preaching at an established church where a number of Dutch immigrants attended. There were also Dutch immigrants that were attending at one of the Presbyterian churches in Milwaukee, and so the scene in Milwaukee was quite a bit different than J.G. tends to make it. Well, on November 21, 1847, tragedy struck just off the shore of Sheboygan. The steamship Phoenix, carrying many Dutch immigrants, caught fire and sank. Brian Winter demonstrates the connection between Zonne and the group in Milwaukee with this tragedy. After Zonne's arrival in Milwaukee, the danger of travel on the frontier was tragically demonstrated on November 21, 1847, when the lake steamer Phoenix, carrying over 200 passengers, most from the Achterhoek region of the Netherlands, caught fire off the shore of Sheboygan County. The loss of the steamer left 179 passengers dead, including 151 Dutch immigrants. The terrible news of the Phoenix was reported in the Netherlands and temporarily stalled additional Dutch immigration to Wisconsin. At public meetings in Milwaukee, a special committee was appointed to recommend measures to prevent future disasters and to collect funds for the afflicted remnant of the large and respectable body of immigrants from Holland, who were suddenly cast upon a foreign shore. Already recognized as a leader among the Dutch, Zonne was appointed to serve on the committee along with Reverend Aaron Chapin, a Presbyterian minister from Milwaukee. Of the 35 survivors of the Phoenix, 25 were Dutch immigrants. These 25 received support from the offerings taken in the churches of Milwaukee. His work on the Relief Committee brought Zonne into contact with a Presbyterian minister and was perhaps his first meaningful connection with Presbyterianism. Though holding some differences in polity, the theology of the Presbyterian Church was entirely compatible with Zonne's Dutch Calvinism. Because there were no connections in Wisconsin with the Dutch organizations in either Michigan or Iowa, Zonne was left free to affiliate with whomever he saw fit. Another significant difference was linguistic. The Michigan and Iowa groups primarily used Dutch in their communications, and they remained insulated from the American culture all around them. According to Winter, in stark contrast to Dutch ministers in Michigan who conducted their affairs almost exclusively in the Dutch language, Zonne routinely served with Americans and used the English language. Furthermore, he had to make arrangements with the local government for the establishment of a new settlement. This included the purchase of land for the immigrants, all of which Zonne superintended. Zonne did not shy away from interaction with his English-speaking American neighbors. Winter observes, in the case of Zonne, membership on the executive committee of the Sheboygan Educational Society, the Sheboygan Agricultural Society, and other committees brought frequent contact with Americans. One last factor was Zonne's negative opinion of Van Raalte and the settlement in West Michigan. He writes disparagingly, saying this, "We may rejoice in our ongoing health. Both we and our children have experienced this. In other places, there are many who have fever and diarrhea. Here, few have died, but the mortality rate in Michigan must be very large. Van Raalte wrote us that there are many dreadful fevers. It seems rather certain that Michigan is extremely unhealthy, and this holds particularly true for the place which Van Raalte chose for his colony. I do not know of a place less suitable than the one planned in Michigan. The advantages which Van Raalte talks so much about seem to be about 90% exaggeration. The Black River is not navigable, and the community is entirely isolated. Everything is much more expensive than here, and sometimes there is inadequate food supply. I am afraid that they will not be able to continue there." And that is just pure heat. Well, what was happening with the Zonne settlement? With the support of the growing Dutch immigrant community in Milwaukee, Zonne began seeking a new home for his group. In late 1847, Zonne and 3 others went to Sheboygan County to investigate the possibilities. Pieter Zonne himself chose the location, which was made up of heavy clay, alternating with sandy hills covered with many trees. It is known that this territory contained a natural source of salt, which later became of inestimable value for the inhabitants. By the spring of 1848, Zonne, much like Van Raalte in Michigan and Schulte in Iowa, bought and resold land to Dutch settlers interested in relocating to what would initially be called the Zonne settlement in Sheboygan County. And just to be clear, he sold the land for a profit. Surprise, surprise, a Dutchman gaining a profit? Well, once the property was acquired, the settlers began building log cabins and clearing timber. As soon as Zonne's own cabin was completed, he began conducting worship services in his home. On September 6, 1848, a congregation was organized with the election of elders, and a call was placed to Reverend Zonne to serve as minister of an independent Reformed church. The settlement flourished quickly with productive farms and a Dutch church which attracted more Dutch settlers. With this growth, a post office was established which used the American name of Cedar Grove as suggested by Zonne. Who named this village? Pieter Zonne. Zonne's later promotional reports indicate something of the progress of the settlement, although there is likely some exaggeration woven in. He writes, "The soil cleared of the trees richly rewards the farmer's industry. Already we have 200 cleared farms, estimated at a total of from 4,000 to 6,000 acres of land. 5 years ago, we had about 50 head of cattle. Certainly at the present moment that this has increased to 1,000 milch cows and young stock, 200 yoke oxen, 500 sheep, 1,000 hogs, 50 hives of bees, and 25 horses. The fish our settlers this year caught in Lake Michigan amount to much more than 200 barrels, each containing 200 American pounds, which are being sold for $7 a barrel. Among my people are some who 5 years ago owned nothing, others who had only $100. Today, they would not sell their possessions for 2,000 Dutch guilders, about 800 American dollars, and some who would not dispose of them for 4,000 guilders, $1,600. 5 years ago, these people had less than nothing. In fact, were heavily loaded with debt. We have, as I am informed, only one pauper, an unfortunate supported by public charity, and this person is blind. We have more than enough of everything. This year, we have sold more than 1,000 head of fattened cattle." While Zonne played a part in founding and developing the community of Cedar Grove, his primary contribution was establishing a Dutch Presbyterian church. As I've already noted, the church that began in 1848 was initially independent of denominational connections. Zonne's tense relations with Van Raalte, coupled with a lack of an RCA presence in Wisconsin, made affiliation with that group unattractive. Zonne's positive interactions with Presbyterians in Sheboygan County made that more of a viable option for his congregation. Zonne's congregation continued to grow, and by 1849, Peter's congregation consisted of more than 80 families, according to J.G. Zonne was convinced the Presbyterian Church held true to Reformed doctrines, and on May 23, 1853, Zonne reorganized his independent Reformed church into a Presbyterian congregation. Winter narrates the result of this decision. He writes, "Although Reverend Zonne had several reasons for affiliating with the Presbyterian denomination and made no discernible changes in his ministry, within months of affiliation, a split occurred in his congregation over the decision. A group of members, including most of the leadership, left from the church and went to organize a separate Reformed church. The split would become the greatest challenge of Reverend Zonne's ministry in America." And this leads directly to the crisis and the trial. This exodus left many questioning the wisdom of affiliating with the Presbyterians. People in his congregation grew increasingly critical of Zonne, and he was well aware of their displeasure. Matters came to a head at the end of 1853 when Zonne announced that he would stop preaching in Cedar Grove until the congregation stopped talking about him. During the early months of 1854, he did not preach in Cedar Grove, but conducted services instead at a schoolhouse in Gibbsville. Some of Zonne's critics in Cedar Grove asserted that he had resigned from being the pastor of the Presbyterian Church. 3 of them, who were members of the breakaway Reformed Church, determined to test the situation by holding a worship service in the Presbyterian Church building. Now keep in mind, this church was literally next door to Zonne's home. It was built on his own property. Knowing that the building would be locked, these men brought axes to break into the church. Once inside the building, 2 of them stood in the pews with songbooks in hand. The other one stood in the pulpit, ready to lead the service. As anticipated, Zonne heard the commotion, and he came over to investigate. As soon as they saw him, they started singing a psalm. Zonne, who was accompanied by his family and friends, entered the building and stopped the proceedings. Pushing the pulpit back, he knocked a Bible and a book of sermons to the floor. The 3 intruders agreed to halt their worship service and reconvene at 2 p.m. At that time, they returned accompanied by the local constable. Winter narrates what happened next. After they entered the church, Jacob Keisel began to read a text from the Bible. As in the morning, Reverend Zonne, his family, and the Jansons again joined the group inside the church, with Reverend Zonne this time taking to the pulpit and leading his group in singing a psalm. Jacob Keisel was not willing to leave the church a second time and ordered Reverend Zonne to keep still and sit down. When the Reverend Zonne failed to stop singing, Keisel declared that Reverend Zonne was disturbing the peace and ordered the constable to remove him from the church. Reverend Zonne left the church without incident, but the disputed use of the church building was not resolved. A warrant was then served on him, and Zonne was arrested. He was put on trial on a charge of disrupting a public worship service in violation of state statutes. The jury was deadlocked and could not reach a verdict. So the case was rescheduled for a later date, and eventually the state dismissed the case altogether. Now, true to form, Zonne countersued for false imprisonment. He was not willing to take this lying down. The local Dutch language newspaper, De Sheboygan Nieuwsbode, ran stories that were critical of Zonne, reporting that Reverend Zonne had, quote, a heart of the criminal set on revenge, that he was a false teacher and a proud and conceited troublemaker. Well, readers of this paper saw the extreme bias of the editor against Reverend Zonne, and consequently, Zonne's reputation was actually enhanced by this ordeal. Zonne continued serving as the pastor of the First Presbyterian Church in Cedar Grove until his death in 1865. And in respect for his wishes, he was buried in the Presbyterian cemetery near to the location where his pulpit had once stood. So, evaluating Pieter Zonne, what do we think of this man? It is beyond debate that turmoil followed Pieter Zonne throughout his life. Opinions of him were strongly divided then, and to some extent even now. Zonne detractors are plentiful, and some scholars dismiss him as an undisciplined and greedy opportunist. He is typically ranked below Van Raalte and Scholte in the eyes of historians of Dutch immigration. Undoubtedly, Zonne had more than his share of enemies, both in the Netherlands and in American Dutch circles. The Sheboygan Nieuwsbode, the largest Dutch-language newspaper in the U.S., cast Zonne in a negative light in their reporting, and that bias continues to color opinions today. So again, what are we to think of this man and his contributions? By all accounts, Zonne was a gifted preacher who proclaimed orthodox doctrine consistent with the secession movement in his homeland. There never were charges against Zonne's teaching or preaching. He was simply not unorthodox. Jacob van Hinte, in his massive book, Netherlanders in America, a study of immigration and settlement in the 19th and 20th centuries in the United States of America, relays the following. Once, when he had spoken to the Netherlanders in Sheboygan, one of them remarked that in his 3 years in America, he had never heard such eloquent preaching in our language about the words of life. It is no wonder that many were simply captivated by him. Well, at the same time, Zonne's personality clearly rubbed some people the wrong way. He provoked hostility at times. He could be very rigid in his views. And those who didn't love him were prone to strongly dislike him and to question his leadership. Now, one possible explanation is that Zonne was a gifted orator whose personality, habits, and life were inconsistent with his public ministry. And church history provides us no shortage of people who could talk the talk but did not walk the walk. Another explanation is more nuanced, and this is what I would prefer. Perhaps Pieter Zonne was a truly exceptional preacher who proclaimed the gospel with effectiveness and power, but who had personal weaknesses that often undermined his spiritual efforts. As with all gifted ministers, there is always an aspect of spiritual warfare running in the background. Satan tempts men in their areas of greatest weakness, and he sometimes uses those weaknesses to blunt their public ministries. Satan is also able to stir up human opposition against effective ministers who preach the gospel in order to discourage their ecclesiastical efforts. In the events leading up to his trial, Zonne was put on the defensive against the initiatives of his critics. They were the ones who provoked the conflict, and then he responded to their provocative actions. Whatever we may decide about Pieter Zonne as a preacher and as a person, we must recognize that he did something that few others have accomplished. Pieter Zonne was a pioneer of Dutch Presbyterianism. He effectively blended the rich heritage of Dutch Calvinism with the strengths of the Presbyterian Church. His congregation in Cedar Grove was the first officially Dutch Presbyterian congregation in the U.S. And for this, he deserves our respect and our appreciation. Now, in the years since Pieter Zonne's death, Dutch Calvinists have migrated into Presbyterianism. Not only does Cedar Grove continue to have an RCA congregation, But then there is Faith Reformed Church, a member of the PCA, and Calvary OPC, which came out of First Presbyterian in 1936. God has used the day of small beginnings to bring about his greater works. I, for one, as a convinced Dutch Presbyterian, am thankful for Pieter Zonne, warts and all. Not a perfect man by any means, but a man used by God that has brought about blessings to his people in Sheboygan County and beyond. Well, as we conclude our conference, I want to make a closing observation about the significance of the age of pioneers. Each of these men whom we've considered labored in obscurity and died without fanfare. I am reminded of the words of Hebrews 11, verse 13. All these died in faith, without receiving the promises, but having seen them and having welcomed them from a distance, and having confessed that they were strangers and exiles on the earth. The work that each of these men did established a basis for what would come later in Wisconsin. Presbyterians were among the first on the scene, and their early labors were effective. In their own ways, they each contributed not only to the culture of Wisconsin, but to that of the Midwest as a whole. John Locke, in his excellent volume, The Good Country, A History of the American Midwest, 1800 to 1900, says this about Midwestern culture in the 19th century. The foundation of this culture was Christianity. Family prayers and Bible readings in Christian homes, it was believed, would help produce virtuous and hardworking young people. Bibles and other Christian symbols were always present in a properly structured household, and many believed, as a young woman in Worthington, Ohio, wrote in her diary, that the Christian home should be a little heaven on earth. Right Christian belief would bring protection. As an Illinois man instructed, put on the armor of God, that ye may be able to stand against the wiles of the devil. Wisconsin Presbyterians played their part, and it was not insignificant. As I said, from 1836 to 1936, Presbyterianism would spread and grow in all corners of our state. And by 1936, there were those 220 Presbyterian congregations in the entirety of Wisconsin. This is truly remarkable. It's a great work of God in the upper Midwest. God used Metoxen, Minor, Marsh, Ordway, Zonne, and others to bring about his good, sovereign purposes. And for this, we are thankful.